The thermometer outside Walter Caldwell's claim shack read 18 degrees below zero on the morning of January 11th, 1876. And Walter figured that made him the smartest man in Pembina County, Dakota Territory. He had built his chimney the way his father built them, the way his father's father built them back in Norway, straight up through the roof where heat belonged. And he had burned through 11 cords of split oak since November doing it, which was a price he paid without complaint because that was what it cost to keep a family alive on the northern plains. He stood at the window that morning, coffee in hand, looking south across 300 yards of frozen prairie to where the land dipped toward Tongue River. Down there, somewhere near that lazy bend in the water, was the place the Russian woman had dug herself into the earth like a badger. And Walter noticed something he had noticed for 3 days running. No smoke, not a wisp, not a thread, nothing rising from that low mound of dirt that Margaret Sheldon called a home. He told his wife Ruth that the Russian woman had finally frozen to death in that ridiculous hole she had insisted on building. He said somebody ought to ride out come spring to see about burying whatever was left. He said it the way a man says something he believes completely, without cruelty, but without doubt. Either the way you might note that a fence post has rotted through or a well has gone dry. Just a fact of the prairie. He was wrong about the chimney. He was wrong about Margaret. And in 48 hours, when the temperature dropped to 43 below zero and the wind started screaming down from Manitoba at 57 miles per hour, Walter Caldwell would understand just how wrong a man could be about the business of staying warm. But that is getting ahead of the story. To understand what happened in January of 1876, you need to go back 20 months to the spring of 1874, when a woman stepped off a train in Dakota Territory carrying everything she owned in two hands. Margaret Sheldon arrived in Pembina County in May of that year. She was one of 42 homesteaders who filed claims under the Homestead Act, and she was the only one of them who was a woman alone, 31 years old, a widow. She spoke English the way a man drives a wagon over rough ground, slowly and with visible effort, every word chosen carefully and still landing crooked. Her accent was thick German, which confused people because her name was Russian, and her dead husband had been American, and nobody in Grafton could quite figure out where she came from or what she was doing in Dakota Territory. The German accent had an explanation that nobody bothered to ask about. Margaret had grown up in Saratov Oblast, deep in the Russian interior, where a large community of Volga Germans had settled generations back. German was her second language before Russian, the tongue of her neighbors, and her schooling and her prayers. English was her third, learned in 6 desperate months in New York City after her husband died, and she realized that the only thing standing between her and the streets was her ability to make herself understood. She carried exactly 3 things with her on the train from New York. 3 things that fit in 2 hands and told the entire story of her life if you knew how to read them. The first was a leather satchel containing the naturalization papers of Samuel Sheldon, her husband. Samuel had been a carpenter from Vermont, 26 years old, who had met Margaret at the port of Hamburg in 1872 when she was trying to buy passage to America and could not make the ticket agent understand her. Samuel spoke no German and no Russian. Margaret spoke no English. But he bought her ticket, and somewhere between Hamburg and New York Harbor, they decided to get married, which they did 3 days after landing. He gave her his name and his citizenship. 6 months later, he gave her something else. He died of typhoid fever in a rooming house on Mulberry Street, leaving Margaret with legal standing in a country she did not understand and nothing else of material value. Samuel Sheldon was 26 years old and had hands that smelled of pine shavings and linseed oil. That was what Margaret remembered most clearly about him years later, not his face, which had already begun to blur in her memory by the time she reached Dakota, but his hands and what they smelled like when he held her on the ship from Hamburg. He had been kind, not performatively kind, not kind in the way that expects something in return, but kind in the quiet way of a man who sees someone struggling and helps because helping is what decent people do. He saw a woman alone at a ticket counter in a foreign port, and he helped her, and then he married her, and then he died, and the entire arc of their relationship from first meeting to final breath lasted 8 months. 8 months is not a long time to be married, but it is long enough to change the legal trajectory of a life. And Samuel's naturalization papers were the reason Margaret could file a homestead claim as an American citizen, rather than starving in a New York tenement as a foreign widow with no English and no prospects. The second thing she carried was a small icon of Saint Seraphim, tarnished almost black, the only object that had belonged to her mother. Her mother had died when Margaret was 19 during a winter so cold that Margaret had to dig the grave herself because the ground was frozen too hard to hire anyone, and she could not afford to wait for spring. She dug for 2 days. The icon had sat on her mother's bedside table for as long as Margaret could remember, and she took it not because she was particularly devout, but because it was the last physical proof that her mother had existed at all. She did not pray to it. She did not light candles before it. She kept it wrapped in a piece of cloth at the bottom of the satchel. And sometimes when the silence of the prairie pressed in too close, she would take it out and hold it, and remember the sound of her mother's voice singing in the kitchen in Saratov, and that memory was prayer enough. The third thing was a rolled set of drawings done in pencil on heavy paper, in a hand that was precise and confident, and not at all the hand of a man who could read or write. These were the drawings of her grandfather Pyotr, and they showed the design of a pechka stove as built in Saratov Oblast. The drawings were detailed to a degree that would have impressed an engineer. Every stone was marked, every angle was noted, every dimension was recorded in a system of measurement that Pyotr had invented himself because he did not know the formal system and did not need it. He knew what he knew with his hands, and his hands had built heating systems for 30 years across a dozen villages in the Saratov region. Pyotr had been a stove builder, not a mason in the general sense, but a specialist, a man who understood heat the way a riverman understands current, the way a farrier understands the shape of a hoof. He built systems called lezhanka, heated benches in which smoke from a firebox traveled not up through a chimney, but horizontally through channels beneath the floor, surrendering its heat to stone and clay and earth before finally cooled and spent, rising through a low exhaust shaft. A family would light a fire in the morning. The fire would burn for 2 hours, and the house would stay warm until the next morning, heated not by flame, but by 6 tons of thermal mass that had absorbed the fire's energy and released it slowly, steadily through the night. He was a large man with large hands and a voice that carried across a room without effort. He could not sign his own name, but he could draw a cross-section of a heating system so precisely that a stranger could build one from the paper alone. He had built lezhanka stoves in farmhouses and village halls, and once in a small church where the priest complained about cold feet during winter services. The priest never complained again. Pyotr charged little for his work, sometimes only a meal and a place to sleep, because he believed that the ability to keep people warm was not a talent to profit from, but a responsibility to fulfill. He taught Margaret to read his drawings when she was a girl, not because he thought she would need to, not because he imagined she would one day carry those drawings across an ocean and build what they described on a frozen prairie she had never heard of. He taught her because she was the only grandchild who would sit still long enough to listen. She would sit beside him on the lezhanka itself, the warm stones beneath her, her legs dangling because she was too short for her feet to reach the floor, and he would trace the lines on the paper and explain why the channels turned where they turned, and why the angles mattered, and why you used river sand mixed with clay and cut straw instead of plain mortar. She absorbed it the way children absorb everything completely, and without knowing she was learning something that would save her life. Pyotr died in 1870. He was 67 years old, which was old for a man in Saratov Oblast, old for a man who had spent his life hauling stone and mixing mortar and kneeling on cold floors to build the systems that kept other people warm. He died in his sleep on his own lezhanka, on a platform of warm stone he had built with his own hands, and Margaret always thought there was a rightness to that, a man dying warm because of what he knew. 4 years later, on the open prairie of Dakota Territory, Margaret unrolled his drawings on the dirt floor of a tent she had pitched near Tongue River and understood for the first time what her grandfather had given her. Not money, not land, not tools, knowledge. The most durable inheritance a man can leave because it weighs nothing and cannot be taken and never wears out. At the land office in Grafton, the clerk looked at the drawings and laughed. He was young, maybe 25, with clean fingernails and no calluses, and he had processed 41 homestead claims that year from men who built things he understood. Log cabins, sod houses, chimneys that went up. Margaret tried to explain. The chimney does not go up, she said. It goes across, under the floor. Small fire warm all day. The earth holds the heat. The clerk laughed louder. Margaret folded the drawings, put them back in the satchel, and did not try to explain again. Not to him, not to anyone. She filed her claim and walked out. That was a thing about Margaret that people noticed but did not understand. She never explained twice. Not because she was proud, though she was in the quiet way of people who have survived things that would break others. She did not explain twice because she had learned early that explaining to someone who does not want to understand is the same as talking to the wind. You spend your breath and the wind does not change direction. Better to save your breath and build the thing and let the thing speak for itself. This was how she operated. This was the principle that would define her time in Pembina County. She proved with her hands what she could not prove with words. She filed on a quarter section where Tongue River made a lazy bend, 160 acres. She chose the spot with the same deliberation her grandfather had used when choosing the site for a stove. Nothing was accidental. The stand of cottonwoods along the river provided the only timber for miles, which meant firewood and roof beams. The river itself provided smooth, round stones for building, the kind that fit together tight and transmitted heat evenly, the kind that Piotr's drawing specified for the firebox, in the first two turns of the channel where temperatures were highest. A spring fed cold, clear water year-round, which meant she would not have to melt snow in winter, a task that consumed fuel and time in equal measure. And the soil was black loam deep enough to lose your arm to the elbow, which meant she could dig without hitting bedrock, and the clay content was high enough to serve as building material when mixed with sand and straw. She read the land the way Piotr read a foundation. Every feature was a resource. Every contour was a design element. You did not impose your plan on the land. You let the land tell you where to build. Walter Caldwell owned the adjacent claim. He was 39 years old, born in Norway, raised in Minnesota, and had been in Dakota Territory for 2 years. He had survived the first terrible winter of 1873 to 74, when the temperature dropped to 38 below, and stayed there for 11 days straight. That winter had nearly killed his family. He burned through his entire wood supply by February. Then he burned the kitchen table, then 2 chairs, then the spare bed frame, breaking it apart with his hands because the axe was outside and outside was death. His youngest child was 2 years old that winter, a boy named Eric, and the boy slept between Walter and Ruth every night because there were not enough blankets, and still the boy coughed in his sleep. And the sound of that coughing in the dark was a sound Walter heard in his dreams for years afterward. Ruth cried every night, not from fear of dying, but from the helplessness of hearing her children suffer and not being able to stop it. Walter had sworn after that winter that it would never happen again. His solution was more wood, more preparation, more cords split earlier in the year, more stacked higher in the shed, more everything. He attacked the problem of cold the way a man attacks any problem that has frightened him badly, with force, with volume, with the absolute conviction that if you just had enough of the right thing, you could overpower whatever was trying to kill you. It was not a stupid approach. It was the approach of a man who had learned from experience, and his experience had taught him that heat came from fire and fire came from wood, and therefore the answer to cold was always and forever more wood. The logic was clean and direct and entirely wrong, but it would take a blizzard to prove it. He told Margaret straight out that she would never make it through one winter alone. He said it standing at the edge of her claim, arms crossed, looking at the flat ground where she had begun to dig. He was not being cruel. Walter Caldwell was not a cruel man. He was being honest in the way that men are honest when they believe they are saving someone from a fatal mistake. He had earned the right to that honesty with a winter that had taken his furniture and nearly taken his children, and he did not give it lightly. Ruth Caldwell was kinder about it. She brought Margaret a loaf of bread and a jar of preserves, walking the 300 yards between claims with the bread wrapped in cloth and the preserves tucked under her arm. She stayed for 10 minutes, spoke slowly, smiled, but her eyes said what Walter's mouth had said: "You will not survive." Ruth was not unkind. She was simply a woman who had already been frightened enough and did not want one more thing to worry about, one more neighbor to mourn, one more grave to visit when the ground thawed. George Harmon had homesteaded a section to the east. He was 53 years old, from Saxony, and he was the most qualified man in Pembina County to judge whether Margaret's design would work. He had built 17 houses in Milwaukee before the financial panic of 1873 wiped him out. 17 houses from foundation to roofline with his own hands and the hands of men he trained. He understood masonry. He understood thermal dynamics. He understood the relationship between fire and stone and air in ways that most men understood the relationship between rain and crops. It was instinct refined by decades of practice, his life's work, his expertise, the one thing he had left after Milwaukee took the houses and the savings and the reputation and everything else. When George lost his business in the panic, he lost more than money. He lost the context in which his knowledge had value. In Milwaukee, he was George Harmon, master builder. In Dakota Territory, he was a 51-year-old bankrupt starting over on a quarter section of frozen dirt. The only thing he carried west that nobody could take from him was what he knew about building. And so he held that knowledge close the way a man holds the last thing he owns, and he defended it the way you defend the last thing you own, which is to say absolutely and without compromise. If his knowledge about heating was wrong, he had nothing left. When George eventually saw Margaret's heating system, he would explain precisely why it could not work. And every word he said would be technically correct according to the principles he had spent 40 years learning. That was the tragedy of George Harmon. He was not wrong because he was ignorant. He was wrong because he was expert in one system and could not see past it to another. His knowledge was not his weakness, it was his blind spot. The very depth of his understanding in one tradition made it impossible for him to recognize value in another. James Proctor had taken up a claim along the river bottom. 41 years old, Irish by blood, American by birth, and old by experience. He had survived the Battle of Antietam, the single bloodiest day in the history of the American Civil War. 22,717 casualties between sunrise and sunset on September 17, 1862. James survived by lying flat in a cornfield for 6 hours while bullets cut the stalks above his head, close enough that the cut leaves fell on his back like green snow. After the war, he spent 3 years laying track for the Northern Pacific Railroad from Minnesota to Montana, through winters that killed men in their sleep in railroad camps where the stoves went cold at midnight and nobody woke up to feed them. James knew what death by cold looked like. He had seen it 5 times in 3 winters. Men who fell asleep in railroad camps when the stove went out and did not wake up. Men whose bodies he had carried stiff and strange to supply wagons in the morning, wrapped in the same blankets they had died under. One of them, a young man from Ohio named Patterson, had been lighter than a living man of the same size, as though the cold had taken not just the life, but some of the substance. James remembered their faces. He remembered the way death by cold looked peaceful, which was the worst part, because you expect death to look like violence, and when it looks like sleep, instead it is harder to carry. When he told Margaret she was going to kill herself within that heating system, he was not speaking from theory or prejudice. He was speaking from the specific and personal knowledge of having found bodies. He was trying to prevent a death he had seen before. Reverend Nathan Whitfield led services every other Sunday in Walter's barn. He was a man of moderate height and moderate build, with immoderate convictions about duty and decency and the proper ordering of a Christian community. He had lost his sister to a house fire in Ohio when he was 12 years old. The fire started in the kitchen, moved to the parlor, and by the time 12-year-old Nathan smelled smoke and ran downstairs, the front hallway was a corridor of flame. He got out through the back door. His sister Sarah, who was 14, ran for the front door, which was her habit, the way she always left the house, and the front door was blocked by a fallen beam that had burned through its supports and dropped across the threshold like a bar across a gate. Nathan stood in the yard and heard his sister's voice through the fire calling his name, and he could not reach her, and she could not reach him. And the voice continued for a time that Nathan would never be able to measure, because some clocks are not made of minutes, but of sounds that never stop echoing, and then the voice stopped. 40 years later, the smell of smoke in an enclosed space still made his hands shake. Not much, not enough for most people to notice, but enough for Nathan to notice, and enough for the shame of it, the grown man still frightened by the memory of a 12-year-old boy standing in a yard to color every interaction he had with fire for the rest of his life. When he heard about Margaret's system, which channeled fire and smoke through enclosed stone passages beneath a dirt floor, he did not see engineering. He saw the specific shape of his oldest nightmare. He worried about sparks escaping through cracks in the stonework. He worried about carbon monoxide seeping through joints while Margaret slept. He suggested, not unkindly, that a woman alone might find better prospects in Minneapolis, where there were proper buildings with proper stoves and people who could look after her. These were Margaret's neighbors. A man who believed in more wood, a man who believed in better engineering, A man who believed in the evidence of frozen bodies. A man who believed fire in enclosed spaces killed people. Not one of them was stupid. Not one was cruel. They were people who had survived hard things and drawn reasonable conclusions from their survival. And they had all built their homes the way Americans built homes, the way the guidebooks from Chicago and Philadelphia said to build them, with chimneys that rose straight and true from firebox to sky, pulling smoke up and heat with it, the way chimneys had pulled smoke since Romans first discovered the principle 1,500 years back. And Margaret dug into the earth instead. She spent June and July of 1874 excavating, alone, with a shovel she had bought on credit from Schroeder's Mercantile in Grafton, a shovel that cost $2.50 that she did not have and would pay off with labor over the course of the following year. She moved dirt from dawn until the light failed, piling it in mounds that would later serve as windbreaks on the north and west sides of her dugout. Her dugout went down 4 feet into the ground and stretched 20 feet long by 14 feet wide. The roof was cottonwood logs layered with sod, making the whole structure nearly invisible from 100 yards away. Just a low mound with a door on the south face and an exhaust pipe that barely cleared the roofline. The south-facing door was not accidental. South caught winter sun. The entry tunnel descended 4 steps before opening into the main room, which meant wind could not blow straight through the door into the living space. It was an airlock, a buffer zone between the prairie and the home, and the 4 steps down meant that cold air, which is heavier than warm air, would pool in the tunnel rather than flowing into the main room. Every piece of the design served every other piece. Nothing was decorative. Nothing was wasted. This was the thinking of Piotr transmitted through pencil lines on paper, now being built into the Dakota earth by hands that remembered what his hands had taught them. There were days during those 2 months of digging when Margaret stopped and leaned against the wall of the half-finished dugout and looked up at the sky. The Dakota sky was larger than any sky she had seen in Saratov, larger than the sky over New York, larger than seemed possible, as though someone had removed the ceiling from the world, and there was nothing between her and the stars but air and ambition. In those moments, she was aware of how alone she was. Not lonely in the dramatic sense, not aching with it, but alone in the practical sense. Nobody was coming to help. Nobody was going to check on her at the end of the day and ask if she had eaten. The bread Ruth Caldwell had brought was a one-time gesture, not the beginning of a friendship, and Margaret understood the difference. She was on her own in a way that was total and permanent and had to be accepted rather than fought. But solitude was not new to her. She had been alone since Samuel died, truly alone since her mother died before that, and she had learned that solitude was not the enemy. The enemy was cold. The enemy was hunger. The enemy was a winter that could kill you in your sleep if you were not prepared. Loneliness was an inconvenience. Freezing to death was a problem. Margaret was a woman who understood the difference between inconveniences and problems, and she did not waste energy on the former when the latter required every ounce of strength and attention she had. Inside the dugout, she built the thing that would make Walter shake his head, that would make George Harmon call a waste of good stone, that would make James Proctor spend 2 hours on an August afternoon trying to talk her out of. The firebox sat in the northwest corner, built from river rock she had hauled up from Tongue River, in a wagon borrowed from James, who had lent it without asking what she needed it for, because that was the kind of man James was. Lending things without questions. Helping without conditions. It was a small kindness that Margaret noted and did not forget. But instead of a chimney rising straight up from the firebox, she built a series of horizontal channels running beneath the floor, snaking back and forth in a pattern her grandfather's drawings labeled Lezhonka. She built the channels from flat limestone. She split herself using a hammer and iron wedges, working along the grain of the stone. You do not force stone to break where you want it to break. You find the line where the stone wants to split, and you follow it. You tap the wedge, listen to the sound, tap again, listen again, and when the sound changes from a dull thud to a sharper ring, you know the fracture is ready to open, and one more tap will do it. This is patient work. This is work that cannot be rushed. Margaret spent 3 weeks splitting limestone before she had enough flat pieces to line 43 feet of channel. The stones fit tight enough that smoke could not escape into the room, but loose enough that heat could radiate through into the packed earth above and around them. The channels ran for 43 feet total, doubling back on themselves 4 times before finally rising through a vertical shaft that exited just 18 inches above the roofline. 43 feet, not 30, not 50, 43 because that was the length that Pyotr had determined through decades of trial and failure gave the best balance between heat transfer and draft. Too short and the smoke escaped still hot, carrying energy up the chimney that should have gone into the floor. Too long and the draft weakened because the exhaust gases cooled too much to create adequate upward pull and smoke backed up into the living space. 43 feet was the answer that Pyotr's hands had found through a lifetime of building and adjusting and rebuilding, and Margaret did not second guess it. The whole system was embedded in clay and river sand mixed with cut straw, a composite material that Pyotr had specified for its combination of thermal conductivity and structural stability. About 6 tons of thermal mass sitting beneath Margaret's feet. 6 tons of material that would absorb heat slowly when the fire burned and release it slowly when the fire died. 6 tons that turned the floor into a battery charged by a 2-hour fire and discharging over 12 to 18 hours, keeping the dugout warm long after the last flame flickered out. She also built 6 cleanout ports along the length of the ductwork, each one a removable stone cap just large enough to reach an arm through and scrape out the soot and ash that would accumulate over a heating season. Pyotr had stressed this in his drawings, marking each cleanout location with a small cross. A system that cannot be maintained is a system that will fail. The channels needed to be clear to draw properly, and the only way to keep them clear was to build in access from the start. It was the thinking of a man who built things to last, who understood that the work did not end when the last stone was laid but continued as long as the system was in use. James Proctor stood watching her mortar the last stone into place on a warm afternoon in August. He had been watching for a while, not speaking, because James was not a man who spoke before he was certain of what he wanted to say. He stood with his arms at his sides, hat pushed back on his head, studying the channel work, with the eyes of a man who had spent years building things in difficult conditions, railroad trestles over river supply sheds, in wilderness camps, rough shelters in places where the only materials were what the land provided. He understood construction. He understood the relationship between plan and execution, and he could see that Margaret's work was precise, that the stones were well chosen and well fitted, that the mortar was consistent, that the channels were straight where they needed to be straight and curved where they needed to curve. The craftsmanship was good. He could not fault the craftsmanship. He could only fault the concept. That fire will not draw right, he said finally. Smoke will back up and you will suffocate in your sleep. He said it quietly, the way a man delivers bad news he wishes were not true. He said it because he had seen 2 men die of carbon monoxide poisoning in a railroad camp in Minnesota in 1871, in a bunkhouse where someone had blocked the chimney vent to keep heat in. They went to sleep warm and did not wake up. James found them in the morning, still in their blankets, looking peaceful, which was the worst part. The most unsettling part, because you expect death to look like violence, but sometimes death looks like sleep, and that is harder to carry. In Saratov, Margaret said without looking up from her work, "My grandfather heat whole house with one fire. Burn in morning, warm all day, all night." "This is not Russia," James said. "No," Margaret agreed. "Is colder." And she kept working. On September 3rd, 1874, she lit the first fire. She arranged dry cottonwood and twisted hay in the firebox with the care of a woman who knew exactly what she was doing and also knew that everything depended on whether the thing she had built worked the way the drawing said it would. She struck the match. The wood caught, the hay blazed, and then the smoke did exactly what James Proctor said it would do. It came back. It curled out of the firebox and into the dugout, thick and acrid, filling the small space with a haze that burned the eyes and scraped the throat. Margaret dropped to the floor where the air was still breathable and lay there on the packed earth, looking up at smoke pooling against the ceiling of her home, and for a moment the design of Pyotr and the knowledge of 43 feet of channel and 6 tons of thermal mass came down to a woman lying on a dirt floor, unable to breathe in the thing she had built with her own hands. If any of her neighbors had walked in at that moment, they would have nodded, every one of them. They would have said what they had been saying for months. "We told you so." But Margaret did not panic. She lay on the floor and she thought. She thought the way her grandfather thought, not with theory, but with the memory of his hands and his voice. He had told her about the first firing. "New systems need to wake up," he said. "The clay is still damp. The channels are cold stone, and cold stone does not create draft. The damper must be set precisely, not too tight, not too loose, but at the angle that allows enough air to enter the firebox to feed the flame while creating enough restriction to push the exhaust into the channels rather than back into the room. You must be patient. You must adjust. The system will find its balance, but you must give it time and you must help it. She crawled to the damper, the sheet iron plate she had fashioned from a piece of scrap metal bought for 15 cents at Schroeder's. The damper sat at the base of the firebox, controlling the primary air supply. She had set it too tight, restricting airflow to the point where the fire could not create enough updraft to push smoke into the channels. She loosened it, turned it a few degrees, waited. Nothing happened for what felt like a long time, but was probably 3 or 4 minutes. Then something shifted. Not dramatically, not like a switch being thrown. More like a river finding a new path after a log dam breaks. The air in the dugout moved differently. The smoke, which had been pooling and spreading and thickening, began to thin near the firebox. It was being pulled down into the first channel, along the limestone passage beneath the floor, through the first turn, through the second. The system was waking up. The stone was warming. The draft was establishing itself. The channels were beginning to do what Pyotr had designed them to do, what they had done in a dozen villages in Saratov Oblast, what they had done for generations before Margaret was born. Within an hour, the floor beneath Margaret's bare feet was warm. She had taken off her shoes at some point without realizing it, standing on packed earth in her stocking feet, and now the warmth rose through the dirt and through the cloth and into the soles of her feet and up into her body. It was not hot. It was not the blast of heat you get from standing in front of an open fireplace. It was gentle and even and pervasive, the warmth of the earth itself, as though the ground had decided to be kind. Within 3 hours, the entire dugout was 72 degrees Fahrenheit. The fire had died to coals. She did not add more wood. The thermal mass was doing its work, 6 tons of stone and clay and earth that had absorbed the fire's energy and were now releasing it back into the air of the dugout at a rate that would maintain comfortable temperature for hours. When she woke the next morning, 10 hours after the last flame had flickered out, the temperature inside was still 68 degrees. Outside, it was 49. Margaret placed her palm flat on the dirt floor, held it there. The warmth came up through her skin, steady and even and real, the same warmth she remembered from childhood, from the Lyshanka in her grandfather's house in Saratov, where she had sat beside an old man who drew pictures of things he could not name and built things that lasted longer than the people who used them. Pyotr had been dead for 4 years, but his knowledge was alive in the stone and clay beneath her hand, 10,000 miles from where he had learned it, working exactly as he said it would. She did not say anything. There was no one to say it to, but she closed her eyes and kept her hand on the warm earth, and whatever she felt in that moment, whether it was gratitude or grief or vindication, or simply the relief of a woman who has bet everything on a dead man's drawings and won, she kept it to herself. It was hers. The warm floor was hers. The proof was hers. And for now, that was enough. The first winter came the way winter comes to the northern plains. Not gradually, not with warning, but like a door slamming shut on a room you can never get back to. One week in late October, the temperature was 40 degrees, and the grass was still brown, and the sky was the color of old iron. The next week, it was 8 below, and the world was white, and the wind had a sound to it that was not like any wind Margaret had heard in Saratov. It was bigger. It moved across a landscape with nothing to stop it, no forest, no hills, no buildings tall enough to break its stride, and it hit the scattered homesteads of Pembina County with a force that made the walls groan and the windows rattle and the flames in every fireplace lean sideways like men ducking a punch. Margaret fed her system carefully that first winter. She learned it the way a man who has driven the same truck for 30 years learns the engine, by sound, by feel, by the subtle difference between a machine running well and a machine about to give you trouble. 1 armload of dry cottonwood, roughly the size of a man's torso, burned for 2 hours and kept the dugout warm for 14 hours if the outside temperature stayed above -20. Below -20, she added half an armload more. She never let the fire roar, never pushed the system past what it was designed to do. The thermal mass beneath her floor absorbed heat slowly and released it slowly, and if you tried to rush it, if you burned too hot, too fast, the heat escaped through the chimney before the stone and clay could capture it. Patience was the system's fuel as much as wood was. She supplemented the cottonwood with twisted hay and dried buffalo chips she had collected during the summer months. Neither burned as hot as oak or hickory, but they burned slow and steady, which was what the system needed. Pyotr had told her this sitting on his warm bench in Saratov, tracing the lines of his drawing with a thick finger. Do not feed a Lyshanka the way you feed a fireplace. A fireplace is a hungry dog that eats everything and gives back little. A Lyshanka is a different animal entirely. It is a draft horse. It eats modestly and works all day. You match the fuel to the system, not the system to the fuel. A quarter cord per week. That was what Margaret burned from September through the end of March. A quarter cord, 7 months, roughly 4.5 cords total for an entire winter. Walter Caldwell burned 7 cords before Christmas. He would not have known that number if you had asked him. Men who burn wood the traditional way do not count cords the way men who buy gasoline count gallons. They just cut and split and stack and burn, and when the pile gets low, they cut and split and stack more. And the labor of it is so constant and so consuming that the total quantity disappears into the rhythm of the work. 7 cords by Christmas was not a number Walter carried in his head. It was a number his body carried in his back and shoulders and hands, in the calluses from the axe handle and the ache that settled between his shoulder blades every evening and never quite left. George Harmon burned roughly the same amount. His cabin was slightly larger than Walter's, built with the same straight chimney design, and he had added refinements that he believed made his system superior. A German heating stove imported from Milwaukee, cast iron with a water jacket that circulated warm water through copper pipes to a second room. A damper system he had engineered himself, adjustable to 3 positions, allowing him to control burn rate with a precision that nobody else in Pembina County could match. By any measure available to him, his setup was the most efficient in the county. And it was, if you defined efficiency the way George defined it, which was the way every builder in America defined it. Efficiency meant how well a chimney drew, how cleanly a fire burned, how little smoke escaped into the living space. By those measures, George's system was excellent. But Margaret was not measuring the same thing. Margaret was measuring how much heat stayed in the house after the fire died. And by that measure, which was the only measure that mattered when your life depended on a finite supply of wood, George's excellent chimney was a beautifully engineered hole in the roof through which 77% of his fuel's energy vanished into the Dakota sky. George came to see the dugout in October of 1874. He came with his hat in his hands, which was the custom when entering another person's home, even when that home was a hole in the ground. He spoke slowly, enunciating each word the way people speak to someone they believe may not understand the language. Margaret understood more English than she could speak. She understood every word George said. She simply lacked the vocabulary to argue with him in his own language, which George mistook for a lack of comprehension, which was a mistake many people made about Margaret Sheldon and which she never bothered to correct. The problem is surface area, George told her. He was standing in the center of the dugout, looking down at the packed earth floor beneath which 43 feet of stone channel carried smoke from the firebox to the exhaust shaft. He spoke with the confidence of a man who had spent his life understanding exactly this kind of problem. Hot air rises. That is physics. That is the law of God and nature. You are forcing smoke to travel horizontal through cold earth, losing heat at every turn. A straight chimney pulls hard, creates draft burns clean. Your system fights against itself. Every sentence was logical. Every principle was sound. And if Margaret had been building a chimney, George would have been absolutely right. But she was not building a chimney. She was building a heat exchanger. The entire point of the system was to force hot gases through cold mass, transferring energy from the smoke to the stone. What George called losing heat at every turn was exactly what Margaret called heating the floor. They were describing the same physical process and reaching opposite conclusions because George had spent 40 years learning one system and could not see past it to another. His expertise was a fortress. It protected everything he knew, and it kept out everything he did not. Margaret asked him one question. She asked it in her broken English without looking up from the stove where she was heating water for tea, and it was the kind of question that sounds simple until it detonates inside your head days later. How much wood you burn yesterday? George frowned. I do not keep count of every piece of wood I burn. I burn 1/4 cord per week, Margaret said. Since September. How much you burn? George did not answer. He put his hat back on, thanked her for her time in the formal way of a man who has decided the conversation is over, and walked out of the dugout into the October afternoon. He did not come back for 14 months. But the question followed him home. It followed him the way a pebble in a boot follows you present, with every step impossible to ignore, too small to justify stopping to remove, but too persistent to forget. It followed him into November, when he loaded his stove for the third time in a single day. It followed him into December, when he split another cord and stacked it against the cabin wall, and calculated without wanting to that he had used more wood in 3 months than Margaret claimed to use in 7. It followed him through the winter of 1874 to 75, and every time he fed his stove, every time he swung his axe, every time his back ached from the work of keeping warm, the question sat in the back of his mind like something he had swallowed that would not go down. The winter of 1874 to 75 was brutal by any standard. 38 below zero for 11 consecutive days. The kind of cold that turns water to ice in a bucket left inside overnight, that makes metal so cold it burns bare skin on contact, that kills livestock if they cannot find shelter, and kills people if they cannot find fire. But it was brutal in the normal way, the expected way, the way that the homesteaders of Pembina County had learned to endure through force and preparation, and the sheer stubborn refusal to die that defined frontier life. Walter burned through his wood supply at a rate that required him to cut and split fresh timber twice a week, even in the worst cold, dragging cottonwood logs from the riverside stand with a horse that did not want to work in -30 and a body that did not want to work either but had no choice. His shoulders ached every night. His hands were cracked and raw from the axe handle despite the leather gloves Ruth had made him. He fell into bed each evening with the bone-deep exhaustion of a man who is doing everything he knows how to do and suspects it may not be enough. George Harmon kept meticulous records that winter, a habit from his building days in Milwaukee. He recorded the outside temperature each morning, the inside temperature at 3 points in his cabin, and the number of times he loaded his stove. The records showed what his body already knew, that his beautifully engineered German stove consumed wood at a rate directly proportional to the wind speed, and that on the worst days when the wind topped 30 miles per hour, his stove ate fuel faster than he could have predicted using any calculation he had learned in 40 years of construction. The numbers bothered him. They sat in his ledger book like small accusations, neat figures in neat columns that told a story he did not want to read. But he did not know what to do about them, because the numbers pointed toward a conclusion that his experience could not accept, and so he did what men do when the numbers challenge everything they know. He cut more wood. James Proctor survived the way he had survived Antietam and 3 winters in railroad camps by staying low and staying steady and not thinking past the next hour. He was the only one of Margaret's neighbors who slept well that winter, not because his cabin was warmer, but because James had learned at the age of 20 to sleep through anything, a skill acquired in army camps where the alternative to sleeping through gunfire and cold and hunger was not sleeping at all, and a man who does not sleep does not survive. He had a way of accepting discomfort that was not resignation but strategy. You do not fight the cold, you endure it. You reduce your needs to the minimum, and you meet the minimum, and you do not waste energy wishing the minimum were higher. Everyone survived that first winter. The children suffered, but they survived. The wood piles shrank to nothing, but they were replenished. The men grew thin and tired from the constant labor of cutting and splitting and hauling, but they made it through to spring, and spring in Dakota Territory was a kind of resurrection. The snow melting the ground, softening the sky, turning from iron to blue, and the simple animal relief of warmth on skin after months of cold. Meanwhile, in the dugout by the river, Margaret burned her quarter cord per week and slept under 1 blanket while Walter's family slept under 4. The floor beneath her stayed warm through the night, every night releasing the heat it had stored during the morning fire in a slow, steady wave that kept the air between 65 and 70 degrees even when the world outside was 38 below. She did not cut emergency wood. She did not burn furniture. She did not lie awake calculating days of fuel remaining. She had enough. She had more than enough. The system Piotr had designed and she had built with riverstone and limestone and 6 tons of clay and sand was doing exactly what it was meant to do. And the margin between what she needed and what she had was so wide that the winter of 1874 to 75 was not a crisis for Margaret Sheldon. It was just winter. But because everyone survived, Margaret's survival proved nothing. Nobody froze to death that year. Nobody lost a child. Nobody burned the last stick of furniture they owned. The winter was hard, but not hard enough to separate luck from design, not hard enough to force the question of whether Margaret's system was genuinely superior or whether she had simply been fortunate, a woman alone in a small space who needed less heat than a family of 5 in a larger cabin. That was the comfortable explanation, the one that required no revision of belief, no admission of error, no acknowledgement that traditional knowledge carried across an ocean in a rolled set of drawings might be worth more than 40 years of American building experience. She was the Russian woman in the dirt hole who had gotten lucky. That was the story people told themselves. And stories, once they take root, are harder to tear out than fence posts. There was a Sunday in February when Margaret walked the 300 yards to Walter's barn for services. Reverend Whitfield read from Genesis the story of Joseph in Egypt, the man who stored grain for 7 years before the famine came, the man who was called a fool by the wise men of Pharaoh's court until the famine arrived and the stored grain was the only thing standing between a nation and starvation. Margaret sat in the back row, which was not really a row, but a plank laid across 2 barrels, and she listened in English that she mostly understood, and she said nothing. She did not draw a parallel between herself and Joseph. Margaret was not a woman who compared herself to Scripture, but the parallel was there hanging in the cold air of Walter's barn like breath visible to anyone who cared to look. Nobody looked. Spring came, then summer. Margaret planted, harvested, preserved. She traded work for goods, mending clothes for Ruth Caldwell in exchange for eggs, repairing a cracked wall in James Proctor's cabin in exchange for the 2 wooden barrels she wanted for water storage. She was not part of the community. She was adjacent to it, present but not included, visible but not seen. This was a position she accepted without complaint because complaint was a luxury she could not afford and because the only approval she needed was the 68-degree reading on the thermometer inside her dugout on a morning when the rest of Pembina County was feeding fires that ate wood faster than men could cut it. James Proctor brought firewood in November of 1875, hauled on a sled he had built himself. Half a cord of split cottonwood stacked outside her door without being asked. Margaret came out and looked at the wood and looked at James and said, "I do not need this much." James shrugged in the way of a man who has done what he felt was right and does not need to explain further. Margaret took a quarter of what he brought and told him to carry the rest home. James did not understand why she needed so little, but he remembered it the way you remember something that does not fit the story you have been telling yourself, a loose thread that will unravel the whole garment if you ever pull it. That autumn, Margaret maintained her system with the same discipline she brought to everything. 3 days of work. Cleaning the channels through the 6 access ports, scraping soot and ash with a long-handled brush she had made from cottonwood branches and horsehair, patching cracks in the clay lining, inspecting joints, testing the damper. Every autumn, the same ritual, the same care. The way a man services a rifle before hunting season, not because it is broken, but because your life depends on it working when you need it, and the time to discover a problem is not when the animal is charging. And then it was January. On the morning of January 9th, 1876, Margaret Sheldon looked at the sky and saw something. The clouds were thin and fast-running from the northwest at high-altitude streaks of white against pale blue that moved with an urgency that ordinary weather does not have. The air tasted metallic, sharp, and clean, like licking a nail. The wind shifted direction twice within a single hour, first from the west, then from the north, then from the west, again, as though the atmosphere could not make up its mind, as though large forces were colliding somewhere beyond the horizon, and the echoes of that collision were reaching Pembina County in the form of confused air. Margaret did not know meteorology. She knew what Piotr knew, which was that certain signs preceded killing weather. The devil's hair, he called those high, thin clouds. When you see the devil's hair, you have 2 days, maybe 3. You do not wait to find out which. She spent the entire day preparing. She hauled water from the spring trip after trip, filling every vessel she owned. 2 wooden barrels, a copper pot, 3 clay jugs, a bucket with a cracked handle that she held with both hands. She brought in extra firewood, stacking it carefully in the entry tunnel where it would stay dry and accessible. She checked her food stores and inventoried them with the precision of a quartermaster. 43 pounds of potatoes in the storage pit beneath the northeast corner, 27 pounds of salt pork hanging from the roof beams, 6 pounds of cornmeal in a sealed tin, dried beans, dried peas, a small wheel of cheese she had earned mending clothes for Ruth. Walter Caldwell saw her working. He was crossing the frozen ground between his cabin and his woodshed when he noticed Margaret making trip after trip to the spring hauling water in the cold. He called out across 300 yards of dead air. "Just winter. You act like the world is ending." Margaret did not answer. She hauled the next barrel. On the afternoon of January 11th, the temperature began to drop. Not the gradual decline of a normal cold front, but a free fall of plunge, as if the air itself were being emptied of whatever warmth it had left. 18 below at noon, 26 below at sunset, 34 below at midnight. The barometer in James Proctor's cabin had been falling for 18 hours, a steady decline, that James watched the way a soldier watches a perimeter, knowing that what comes next will be bad, but not knowing how bad or when. At 2 in the morning on January 12th, the wind arrived. It came with a sound that none of them had words for because the English language and the Norwegian language and the German language had all developed in places where wind was moderated by terrain, by forests, by mountains, by the simple fact of landscape. On the open prairie, there was nothing between Manitoba and Pembina County, but 600 miles of flat earth, and the wind crossed that distance without losing a single mile per hour of its force. It hit the homesteads at 57 miles per hour, with gusts above 60, and it carried with it a volume of snow that turned the air from transparent to opaque in the space of a single breath. Walter Caldwell's chimney, that straight, proud chimney, built the way his father and his father's father had built them, became a liability within the first hour. The wind found the chimney mouth and roared down it like water through a pipe, carrying smoke and ash backward through the flue and into the cabin. The air inside filled with a choking gray haze that made the children cough, and Ruth covered their faces with wet cloth. Walter had two choices: close the damper and lose the fire, or leave it open and suffocate. He closed the damper. The fire, starved of oxygen, dropped to coals, then to ash, then to nothing. The temperature inside the cabin began to fall. 14 degrees in the first hour. Ruth pulled the children into bed, all three of them, and piled everything they owned on top of the pile of small bodies. And she did not cry because she was past crying. She was in the place beyond tears where the body conserves energy for survival and does not waste moisture on grief. James Proctor's cabin was smaller, tighter, partially dug into a south-facing slope that gave him earth insulation on the windward side. His chimney drew hard in the storm, too hard, the wind across the chimney mouth, creating a suction effect that pulled air through his firebox at 3 times the normal rate. His wood burned fast, too fast. He did the calculation in his head, the same kind of calculation he had done at Antietam when the ammunition was running low and the attack showed no signs of ending. Consumption rate times remaining supply divided by unknown duration. If the storm lasted 4 days, his wood would last 3. He fed the fire one piece at a time, rationing, trying to slow the burn, knowing that the wind was the enemy and his own chimney was the enemy's ally. George Harmon had the most sophisticated system and the worst result. His German stove, his water jacket, his circulating pipes, his precisely engineered damper. All of it assumed conditions that no longer existed. The wind created a Venturi effect at his chimney mouth, accelerating the updraft, sucking heat straight out of his house before it could warm anything. He was burning a cord of wood every 18 hours. A cord. 18 hours. His entire carefully calculated winter supply would be gone in less than a week. The mathematics of his situation were clear and merciless. He was losing, and the opponent was physics, and George Harmon, who understood physics better than anyone in Pembina County, could not find a way to make physics work in his favor because the physics he understood were the physics of normal conditions, and these conditions were not normal. These conditions were the physics of extremity, the physics of a world trying to kill you, and the rules were different. Inside Margaret Sheldon's dugout, the thermometer read 71 degrees. She had lit her fire at dawn on January 11th, before the storm, burning a careful arrangement of dry cottonwood that heated the thermal mass beneath her floor for 15 hours. By the time the wind arrived, she had let the fire die to coals, adding just enough fuel to maintain a gentle warmth. The storm could not reach her chimney. The exhaust shaft rose only 18 inches above the roof, and snow had drifted over most of it within the first hours, leaving a small opening just large enough to draw the faint air the coals needed to survive. Wind that was destroying chimneys 300 yards away could not find hers. Earth that was conducting cold into every cabin in the county was conducting stored warmth into her dugout. The horizontal channels beneath her floor had spent 15 hours absorbing heat, and now they were releasing it slowly, steadily, the 6 tons of thermal mass doing exactly what Pyotr had designed them to do. She burned 1/8 of a cord during the entire first day of the blizzard. 1/8. Walter, if he could have kept his fire burning, would have needed 2 full cords for the same warmth. The blizzard lasted 4 days. The temperature reached 43 below on the second night, and the wind never dropped below 40 miles per hour for 76 consecutive hours. Snow accumulated in drifts that buried Walter's cabin to the eaves that sealed James Proctor's door shut, that erased every landmark and reference point until the prairie looked like the surface of an alien world, white and featureless and shifting. On the second night at the bottom of the cold, James Proctor sat on his bed and took off his left boot. He had avoided doing this for 2 days because some knowledge is better postponed, and he knew in the way that a man who has seen frostbite knows that what he would find inside that boot would not be good news. The boot was wet. It had been wet since the first day. He had not dried it because drying boots required heat near the stove, and the stove was consuming wood too fast to spare any heat for boot leather. He pulled the boot off, then the sock, which was stiff and cold and clung to his skin. 3 toes on the outside of his left foot were black, not bruised, not discolored, black, the color of coal, the color of wood that is burned to carbon. Hard to the touch, like wood, like something that was no longer flesh but had become a different material entirely. James sat on the bed and looked at his toes for a long time. He thought about Antietam, where he had seen men lose legs and arms and jaws, where the surgeon's tent was a place of sounds that he still heard sometimes in the quiet moments before sleep. 3 toes was nothing compared to what those men had lost. 3 toes was a cheap price for being alive. But 3 toes was still his, and they were not coming back, and he would walk differently for the rest of his life, and every step would be a small reminder of this storm, and this boot, and this cabin that could not keep itself warm enough to keep flesh alive on his foot. On the 3rd day, Walter Caldwell made a decision born of desperation. His wood was gone, all of it. The oak he had split and stacked, the kindling he had bundled, the 2 chairs he had broken apart on day 2, the table he had dismantled with his bare hands on the morning of day 3, pulling the joints apart because he did not have the energy to swing an axe. The cabin was 39 degrees and falling. Ruth had stopped talking. The children were silent under their pile of blankets and coats, a silence that frightened Walter more than crying would have, because children who have the energy to cry still have the energy to live, and children who have gone silent may be saving their last reserves for something Walter did not want to think about. He decided to make a run for George Harmon's place, 170 yards east. He had walked that distance 1,000 times. He tied a rope around his waist, knotted it twice, tested the knot, tied the other end to the iron door handle of his cabin, tested that knot too. He looked at Ruth. Ruth looked back at him with an expression he would carry for the rest of his life, an expression that was not permission and not prohibition, but a kind of terrible neutrality, the face of a woman who understood that her husband was about to risk his life and that she could neither stop him nor help him, and that the outcome was entirely in the hands of wind and cold and the strength of a rope. He opened the door and stepped out. The wind hit him like a physical object, like a wall that moved. He went sideways, then down hands and knees on ice crust that cut through his gloves. He could not see, could not hear anything but wind, could not breathe without inhaling snow. He crawled. Forward, he thought. East, he thought. But the prairie in a whiteout has no directions. There is no east. There is no forward. There is only white above and white below and white in every direction. And the human sense of orientation, which relies on visual landmarks and horizon lines and the subtle cues of light and shadow, fails completely when every photon entering the eye is the same color. He crawled 47 feet. He knew this because he measured it later after the storm, pacing from his front door to the point in the snow where his handprints and knee marks ended, at a churned-up circle of ice where he had stopped and knelt and understood that he was lost. 47 feet from his door, 123 yards from George Harmon's cabin. He had made it less than a third of the distance. and he could not tell which direction he had traveled or which direction home was. The rope saved him. He pulled himself back, hand over hand, arm over arm, his fingers so numb that he could not grip the line and had to hook his wrists around it and drag himself along like a man climbing a rope in a gymnasium. Except the gymnasium was 43 below zero, and the rope was the only thing in the world that connected him to survival. He reached the door. Ruth pulled him in. His face was bleeding from ice driven into the skin by wind. His fingers were white to the second knuckle, the color that flesh turns when blood has retreated from the extremities, to protect the core, the color that precedes black if the cold continues. Walter lay on the floor of his cabin and understood something that cost him 47 feet and nearly his life to learn. He had been a fool. Not a bad man, not a stupid man, a fool. A man who thought he knew how winter worked because he had survived winters in Norway and winters in Minnesota and 2 winters in Dakota, and none of those winters had taught him the lesson that this storm was teaching. Now that the plains in a blizzard are not an environment where human experience applies, that the combination of cold and wind and open distance creates conditions that do not exist anywhere else on the continent, and that everything he knew about staying warm, everything his father knew, everything his father's father knew back in Norway, where forests broke the wind and neighbors lived within calling distance, all of it was useless here. Worse than useless. It was dangerous because it gave him confidence in methods that failed precisely when failure meant death. Down in the dugout, 4 feet beneath the surface of a world that was trying to kill every living thing exposed to it, Margaret Sheldon could not see the storm. She could barely hear it. The 4 feet of earth above her head and the 2 feet of sod on the roof reduced the 60-mile-per-hour wind to a low vibration, a hum more felt in the chest than heard in the ears, like the memory of thunder rather than thunder itself. The dugout was warm, the floor was warm, the air was warm. The thermometer had not dropped below 68 degrees since the storm began. She spent the days doing handwork by lamplight, mending a tear in her heavy coat, braiding rope from dried grass, a skill she had learned as a girl in Saratov, where every household made its own cordage. Reading a Bible printed in German that Reverend Whitfield had loaned her, with the gentle suggestion that it might provide comfort during the long winter evenings, and Margaret had taken it not because she needed spiritual comfort, but because she liked the language and the reading practiced her German, which was in danger of rusting from disuse. She lit 1 fire each morning. 1 fire, enough to recharge the thermal mass. The fire burned for 2 hours, maybe less, and then she let it die, and the floor kept her warm through the day and through the night. Her fuel consumption over the 4 days of the blizzard was 1/2 cord total. George Harmon burned a cord every 18 hours. Walter would have burned 2 cords per day if his chimney had not failed him. Margaret burned 1/2 cord in 4 days. The numbers were not close. The numbers were not into the same category. The numbers were the difference between a system designed for exactly these conditions and a system designed for conditions that had ceased to exist the moment the wind reached 57 miles per hour. There were moments during those 4 days when she sat still and thought about the people 300 yards north. She knew the physics. She knew what the wind was doing to straight chimneys. She had known since she was a girl that vertical chimneys were vulnerable to downdraft and high wind, that the taller the chimney, the worse the problem, that what worked in calm conditions became a liability in storms. She knew that right now, at this moment, Ruth Caldwell was huddling with 3 children under every blanket they owned, while the temperature in their cabin dropped degree by degree toward a number that human bodies cannot survive. She knew, and she could not help. The distance between her door and Walter's barn was 300 yards of flat ground covered in 4 feet of snow under 60-mile-per-hour wind at 43 below zero. And that 300 yards might as well have been 300 miles for all the good her knowledge could do anyone on the other side of it. The helplessness of knowing was its own kind of suffering, different from cold, quieter, but real. On the 4th day, the wind stopped. Not gradually, not in stages, not with the diminishing gusts and increasing intervals that normally mark the end of a storm. It stopped all at once, suddenly and completely, as though someone had closed a valve or pulled a plug or flipped a switch. One moment the world was screaming, and the next moment it was silent, and the silence that followed was so profound, so total, so unlike anything that had existed for the previous 96 hours that James Proctor, sitting by his dying fire on 3 dead toes, thought for one disorienting moment that he had gone deaf. The temperature remained at 37 below, but without the wind, 37 below was a different thing entirely. It was cold you could stand in, cold you could walk in, cold that would kill you slowly rather than instantly. The world was navigable again, and the question that had been waiting behind the wind now pushed itself to the front of every mind in Pembina County. Who was still alive? Part 3. The Door That Opened. Walter Caldwell emerged from his cabin on the morning of the 5th day into a world he did not recognize. The prairie had rearranged itself during those 4 days and nights into a landscape of white dunes and valleys and ridges that bore no resemblance to the flat ground he had walked every day for 2 years. His woodpile was gone, not merely burned, but buried, and what remained beneath the snow would not have filled a wheelbarrow. His fence posts had vanished beneath drifts that were smooth and curved and looked almost intentional, as though the wind had been sculpting rather than destroying. The path to his outhouse, worn into a permanent rut by 2 years of daily use, had ceased to exist. Everything he knew about the geography of his own land was wrong. He stood in his doorway and looked at this new world, and the world looked back at him with the blank indifference of a thing that does not care whether you live and love and never has and never will. His children were alive. That was the first thing he established, and the only thing that mattered in the first minutes of that morning. All 3 were breathing, conscious, awake, and the 2 older ones were complaining about the cold and about hunger and about the fact that their father had burned the kitchen table, which was a good sign because children who have the energy to complain have the energy to survive. But young Eric, the boy who had been 2 years old during the first terrible winter and was now 4, had toes that were white and numb on his left foot, and when Ruth tried to warm them by rubbing them, he did not react. He did not cry. He did not pull away. He looked at his mother with the curious detachment of a child who does not understand what is happening to his body, and Ruth looked at Walter, and the expression on her face was not anger and not accusation, but something that Walter would carry in his chest for the rest of his life. It was the face of a woman who had trusted her husband to keep their children safe and was watching in the white stillness of a winter morning the limits of what trust can do. Walter pulled on his boots and went outside to dig. George Harmon was the first neighbor he reached. 170 yards to the east, the same distance that had nearly killed Walter 2 days earlier, now walkable in the windless cold through drifts that reached his thighs and made every step an act of deliberate labor. George was alive. His cabin was standing. But the interior told a story that did not need words. The woodpile was gone, every cord he had calculated and measured and stacked with the precision of a man who trusted mathematics the way some men trust God. He was burning green wood now's logs he had cut the previous summer and set aside to season for the following winter wood that was not ready, that hissed and spat and smoked because the moisture inside was turning to steam before the wood could ignite properly. His cabin was thick with haze, his eyes red, his voice hoarse. George Harmon stood in his doorway, looking 10 years older than he had looked 5 days earlier, and when Walter asked if he had wood to spare, George laughed. It was not a laugh that had humor in it. It was the sound a man makes when irony has become physical, when the gap between what you planned and what happened is so wide that the only response left is the one that sounds like laughing, but is not. They dug a path to James Proctor's cabin. James was sitting on his bed with his left boot off the 3 dead toes exposed to the cold air of the room. He had been sitting like that when they arrived, not in shock, but in the quiet aftermath of shock, the place a man reaches when he has examined a wound long enough to accept it. He looked up at Walter and George standing in his doorway. 2 men who looked as worn and damaged as he felt, and he asked only 2 words. "Everyone alive." "Everyone is alive," Walter said. "Then we are luckier than we have a right to be," James said, and he pulled his boot back on carefully over the toes that would never feel a boot again and stood up to help dig. They reached Reverend Whitfield's place by mid-morning. Whitfield had come through in better shape than the rest, partly because his cabin was small and tight and well-built, partly because he lived alone, and one man generates enough body heat to make a difference in a space the size of a good closet. He was shaken but intact, his hands steady, his voice strong, his faith in God's mercy undamaged by 4 days that had tested the faith of everyone else. The 4 men stood together in the thin January sunlight, stamping their feet, blowing into their hands, looking at each other with the shared expression of men who have survived something they are not yet ready to talk about. Then someone said it, the thing that had been waiting to be said since the first shovel hit the first drift. "What about the Russian woman down by the river?" Walter answered. He said what he had said 5 days ago, standing at his window looking south at the absence of smoke. "She is dead. Stuen has to be. Nobody survives in a half-buried hole with a chimney that runs backward. If the smoke did not get her, the cold did." There was a silence, short, heavy, the kind of silence that men observe when acknowledging death on the frontier, where death was frequent enough to be expected, but never frequent enough to be casual about. Reverend Whitfield broke it. He said that whatever they found down there, decency required them to go and look. If there was a body, it should be buried properly. If there were belongings, they should be gathered for whatever family Margaret might have back in Russia. It was the Christian thing to do, and Nathan Whitfield believed in doing the Christian thing even when it meant walking a quarter-mile through waist-deep snow at 37 below zero to find a body he was not sure he wanted to find. 6 men set out. Walter George James Whitfield and 2 others from neighboring claims who had dug their way to the Caldwell place that morning, drawn by the universal instinct of frontier people to check on each other when the worst is past. They followed the line of fence posts that marked the boundary between Walter's claim and Margaret's, the posts visible only as faint bumps in the snow, and they walked single file because the man in front broke trail through thigh-deep drifts, and the men behind followed in his footsteps, and there was not enough energy among them for any other arrangement. The walk took 40 minutes. In summer, it took 6. Nobody spoke, partly because speaking at 37 below zero costs moisture and calories that a depleted body cannot spare, and partly because nobody wanted to say out loud what all of them were thinking. They were walking to a grave. They were going to find the frozen body of a woman they had warned and advised and pitied and underestimated, a woman who had built a thing they said could not work and who had died because they were right. And being right about someone's death is the most hollow victory a man can claim. They found the dugout, or rather, they found where the dugout had to be a mound in the snow, barely distinguishable from the natural drifts around it. The low profile that had always made it hard to spot that Walter and George and James had all pointed to as evidence of poor construction had served its purpose exactly. A structure that barely rose above the prairie was a structure the wind could barely find. The entry tunnel on the south side was blocked by a drift, but a small one, smaller than the drifts that had buried Walter's door and sealed James's, because the mounds of excavated earth that Margaret had piled as windbreaks 2 summers ago had deflected the worst of the accumulation. Even the snow management had been designed. They cleared the drift in 5 minutes. 6 men with shovels made quick work of what one woman would have struggled with, and then they were standing at the door of the dugout, 4 steps down the entry tunnel, leading into darkness, and Walter knocked. There was a moment of silence, a long moment, long enough for Reverend Whitfield to begin composing in his mind the prayer he would say over Margaret's body, the scripture he would read. Long enough for James to think about the bodies he had found in railroad camps, the ones that looked peaceful, and to hope that Margaret looked peaceful too. Long enough for George to think about the question she had asked him, "How much would you burn?" and to wish briefly and painfully that he had answered honestly instead of leaving. The door opened. Heat came out, not a trace of warmth, not a faint suggestion of temperature above freezing. Heat, real heat, physical heat, heat that rolled out of that doorway like a wave, like a wall, like a living thing, and hit 6 frozen men in the face with a force that made them step back. The sensation was beyond surprising. It was dislocating. It was as though reality had cracked, and through the crack was pouring a different world, a world where warmth existed in the ground, where 4 days of killing blizzard had left this one small space untouched, where the rules that governed every other building in Pembina County did not apply. Margaret Sheldon stood in the doorway. She was wearing a shirt, a cotton shirt, the kind you wear indoors on an autumn afternoon when the temperature is comfortable, and there is no reason to dress for cold, because there is no cold. No coat, no shawl, no heavy wool sweater or buffalo robe or desperate layering of every garment she owned. A shirt, and she was looking at 6 men who were wrapped in every piece of clothing they possessed. Men with raw faces and red eyes and cracked lips and frozen beards, one of whom was standing on a foot with 3 dead toes, another of whom had blood dried in the creases of his face where wind-driven ice had cut the skin 2 days ago, and her expression was not triumph and not vindication and not the look of a woman who has been proven right after months of being told she was wrong. Her expression was surprise, simple, genuine surprise that they were there. and then concern. "Are you all right?" she said. "Do you need help?" The thermometer on the wall behind her left shoulder read 68 degrees. 6 men stood in the cold and no one spoke. The silence lasted a long time. It was not an empty silence. It was full packed tight with the recalculation of everything each man had believed about heating and building and survival and the limits of what one person could know. It was a silence in which foundations shifted and walls came down and rooms that had not existed before opened up in the architecture of 6 different minds. Walter Caldwell, who had told his wife 5 days ago that Margaret was dead, who had laughed at her preparations, who had burned 11 cords of oak and then his furniture, and nearly dead 47 feet from his own front door, stood at the threshold and felt heat rising through his boot soles from the floor of the dugout, through the frozen leather, through the wet socks, into the damaged skin of feet that had been cold for 96 hours. And his face did something complicated that was not crying, but was the closest Walter Caldwell would ever come to crying in the presence of other men. George Harmon broke the silence. He spoke quietly, so quietly that the men standing behind him leaned forward to hear. His voice had none of the confidence it carried when he stood in this same room 15 months earlier, explaining the laws of physics and the law of God. It was the voice of a man in the presence of something he does not fully understand but knows is important. The voice you use in a church or beside a deathbed or in the moment when you discover that the world is larger than you thought. He said 5 words. "May I come in and look at your heating system?" He did not say I was wrong. He did not say you were right. He did not apologize for the slow, careful English or the condescension or the 40 years of certainty that had blinded him to a possibility his experience had never included. He asked to see the system. He asked to learn. And in the asking was everything. Because George Harmon had built his identity on knowing how to build, and asking to learn from someone he had dismissed was not a small thing. It was the largest thing. It was a man stepping outside the fortress of his own expertise and standing in the open undefended, willing to be taught by a woman half his age who spoke his language badly and who had been right when he was wrong. Walter spoke next. He said it carefully, the way you handle something fragile. "Could you explain again how it works, slower this time?" Maybe I did not understand properly the first time. The words were precise. Maybe I did not understand, not maybe I did not listen, not maybe I was too proud to hear. Maybe I did not understand. A kindness to himself that Margaret did not challenge because Margaret had never needed anyone to say they were wrong. She only needed them to come back and look. James Proctor, standing on his ruined foot with his weight shifted right to spare, the 3 dead toes on his left, spoke last. "In Russia," he said, "your grandfather heated the whole house with 1 fire." Margaret nodded. "That design," James said. "It really works." "Works very well," Margaret said. "You want to come inside, is warm." They came inside, all 6 of them filling the small dugout with the steam of their breathing and the smell of smoke on cold wool and the particular silence of men who are seeing something for the first time that they should have seen long ago. Walter was the first to kneel. He took off his gloves and placed both hands flat on the packed earth floor and held them there, feeling heat rise through dirt into skin, and he stayed down for a long time. Nobody asked him what he was doing. Nobody needed to. He was feeling the evidence. He was letting the floor tell him what Margaret's words had tried to tell him, and what the wind and the cold and the near death in the snow had tried to tell him, and what his own frozen children should have told him if he had been able to hear. That heat does not have to go up. That warmth does not have to come from a fire you can see. That the earth itself, properly prepared, properly taught, can hold heat the way a good man holds a promise steadily and for a long time after the original flame is gone. George Harmon inspected the system with the eyes and hands of a man who has built things his entire life and knows quality when he sees it. He got down on his knees and looked through the clean-out ports into the channels, the flat limestone passages that ran beneath the floor in their 43-foot serpentine path. The stones were warm to the touch. Even after 4 days, even after a blizzard that had exhausted every other heating system in the county. He measured the channel width by eye. He estimated the total surface area. He calculated in his head the way he had calculated 1,000 construction problems before the thermal conductivity of limestone times the surface area times the temperature differential times time. The number that emerged was approximately 78%. 78% of the wood's potential energy converted into useful heat retained in the thermal mass, compared to 23% for an open fireplace, compared to 45% for the best chimney stove he had ever built, 340% more efficient than conventional design. He said the number once quietly to no one, 340%. Then he was quiet for a long time, and the expression on his face was not shame or defeat, but something more private and more difficult, the expression of a man who has spent his life in a building he thought was complete and has just discovered an entire wing he never knew about. Reverend Whitfield stood in the corner near the firebox and looked at the system, and for the first time in more than 40 years he looked at fire in an enclosed space and his hands did not tremble. The fire here, what remained of it, a bed of coals barely glowing in the firebox, was not the fire that killed his sister. That fire had been wild, uncontained, a force of destruction that obeyed no one and consumed everything in its path. This fire was controlled, channeled, directed through stone passages where it could not escape, where it surrendered its heat to the earth and emerged at the other end as cool exhaust, spent and harmless. This was fire that served instead of fire that destroyed. This was fire that healed instead of fire that killed. And something in Nathan Whitfield that had been clenched tight since he was 12 years old, since he stood in a yard in Ohio and heard his sister's voice, stop, loosened. Not completely, not all at once, but enough. Enough for him to know that there was a kind of fire that did not have to frighten him. The transformation that followed was not instant. It was not a single moment of conversion, but a gradual process of learning and adaptation that unfolded over months and years, the way all real change unfolds slowly with setbacks and misunderstandings, and the particular difficulty that attends any revision of deeply held belief. Walter Caldwell was the first to ask Margaret to draw out her design to explain the dimensions and the principles in detail. He spent 2 full days in the dugout measuring the channels with a knotted string, counting stones, asking questions about draft and damper angles and the ratio of thermal mass to living space. Margaret explained everything. She explained patiently, using her hands when her English failed, her drawing diagrams in the dirt floor with a stick when hands were not enough. She did not withhold information. She did not charge for her knowledge. She did not say, "I told you so," not once, not even with a look. She taught because Pyotr had taught her freely and without conditions, and the knowledge did not belong to her. It belonged to anyone who needed it. It belonged to the cold. Walter came back a 3rd day, and this time he brought Ruth. Ruth stood in the dugout with her shawl clutched tight around her shoulders, not because it was cold inside, but because she had been cold for so long that her body did not yet believe in warmth. And she looked at the floor and the walls and the simple stone firebox in the corner and the damper made of scrap iron, and she said nothing for a long time. Then she said very quietly, "Would this have kept my children warm?" Margaret looked at her and said yes. Ruth closed her eyes and stood still, and when she opened them again, something had changed in the set of her mouth. Not anger exactly, but resolution. The expression of a woman who has decided that her children will never again sleep in a house heated by a chimney that the wind can defeat. Walter spent the spring of 1876 redesigning his cabin. He could not dig channels beneath the existing log floor without dismantling the entire structure, so he compromised. He built an addition on the east side, a new room with a sunken floor and an underfloor heating system adapted from Margaret's design. The channels were shorter than hers, only 28 feet, because the room was smaller, but the principle was the same. River stone, flat limestone, clay and sand and straw, a low exhaust that the wind could not reach. George Harmon helped with the masonry, applying his 40 years of building experience to a system he had once called impossible, and the collaboration between George's technical skill and Margaret's traditional knowledge produced a hybrid that was in some ways better than either original. The following winter, the addition stayed warm on a quarter of the wood that the original cabin consumed. Walter's children slept in the new room. They slept warm. They slept through the night without coughing. And Walter Caldwell, lying awake in his own bed, listening to the silence of children who were not suffering, understood that he had been given something by a woman he had dismissed, and the debt could not be measured in cords of wood or pounds of stone. George Harmon approached the problem as the engineer he had always been. He began sketching modifications, adapting Margaret's Russian principles to American construction methods, and in doing so he paid Margaret the deepest compliment one builder can pay another. He did not merely copy her design, he built upon it. Could you run channels beneath a log cabin floor? Yes, if you dug out the existing floor and lined the trench with stone. A sod house, easier because sod walls already provided earth insulation. Waterproofing for wet climates. An additional layer of clay sealed with animal fat. Maintenance access. Clean-out ports every 8 feet along the channel length, just as Margaret had built them. George took what Margaret knew and extended it. Translated it, made it available to people who would never build a dugout, but who might, with the right guidance, build a heating system that captured 78% of their fuel's energy instead of 23. Word spread through Pembina County and beyond. By March of 1876, homesteaders from Grafton and Grand Forks were making pilgrimages to Margaret's dugout, traveling distances that would have seemed absurd a year earlier to visit a woman who had been dismissed as ignorant. The Russian woman with the underground stove that burns one log where others burn 10. The description was not accurate in its details, but it was accurate in its spirit, and Margaret showed every visitor the same thing she had shown Walter and George. A small fire, 6 tons of thermal mass, a dugout warm enough for shirt sleeves in the middle of a Dakota winter. Some understood immediately, some did not. Some went home and tried to build what they had seen and failed because they missed a critical detail: the angle of the damper, the ratio of channel length to chimney height, the specific mix of clay and sand and straw that allowed heat to radiate while maintaining structural integrity. But some succeeded. By the winter of 1877 to 78, 14 homes in Pembina County had variants of Margaret's heating system. By 1880, the number was 43. The designs varied. Some used brick instead of limestone. Some ran the channels in different configurations, spirals instead of serpentines, shorter runs with larger cross-sections. Some combined elements of the Russian Pechka with German Kasselofen techniques that George Harman introduced, creating hybrid systems that captured the best features of both traditions. But every successful system shared the same fundamental principles: maximize thermal mass, minimize heat loss through the chimney, use the earth as insulation, and match the fuel to the system, burning moderate sustained heat rather than intense bursts, feeding the draft horse instead of the hungry dog. James Proctor rebuilt his cabin in the summer of 1877. He laid flat river stones beneath the main room in a small sleeping alcove, running channels in a pattern that Margaret helped him design, adapted to the specific dimensions and orientation of his home. She came to his place 3 times during the construction, once to mark the channel layout in the dirt, once to check the stone fitting before he mortared, and once to inspect the completed system before the first firing. Each visit she brought bread she had baked in her dugout, and James provided coffee that he brewed strong enough to strip paint, and they worked together in a silence broken only by the necessary words of construction. Put this stone here, turn this angle, open the damper to here. It was the language of building, which needs no fluency and no grammar, only precision. He burned 70% less wood than he had before, and his cabin stayed warmer than it had ever been with a conventional fireplace. The first morning after the first firing, James woke to a warm floor and lay in his bed for a long time, feeling the heat come up through the boards. And he thought about the 2 men he had found dead in the railroad camp in Minnesota, the ones who looked peaceful in their blankets. And he thought about how different warmth feels when you know the science behind it, when you understand that the floor is warm, not because of luck or accident, but because 43 feet of stone channel is releasing stored energy according to principles that work the same way every time. Knowledge takes the fear out of comfort. When you understand why you are warm, you do not lie awake wondering when the warmth will end. He walked with a limp for the rest of his life, the 3 missing toes altering his gait in a way that became so familiar to the people of Pembina County that they stopped noticing it the way you stop noticing a feature of the landscape you pass every day. But James noticed. Every step reminded him. Not with pain, because the pain faded within a year, but with the slight mechanical wrongness of a foot that was no longer complete, the subtle shift of balance that meant his right hip worked harder than his left, and his lower back ached on long walks, and he could not stand on his left foot alone without wobbling. 3 toes. Such small things, such ordinary pieces of a man's body that nobody thinks about until they are gone, and then you discover that the body is an integrated system, and the loss of any part changes every other part. He visited Margaret from time to time in the years that followed, not to discuss heating anymore, but to drink tea and sit in a warm room with someone whose company he had come to value. They did not talk much during those visits. Neither of them was given to unnecessary speech. James would sit in the chair Margaret had placed near the stove, the same chair every visit, and Margaret would sit across from him with her mending or her rope braiding, and the fire would tick quietly in the firebox, and the floor would be warm, and the silence between them was comfortable. The silence of two people who had earned each other's respect through different kinds of endurance, and that was enough for both of them. Reverend Whitfield spent 6 months studying Margaret's design before he became its most vocal advocate. When he endorsed something, he endorsed it fully with the conviction of a man who has tested his doubts against evidence and found the evidence persuasive. He included sketches of the heating system in letters to friends and family in Wisconsin, describing it as a practical application of Christian stewardship, using God's resources wisely, wasting nothing, surviving through wisdom rather than brute force. It was theology expressed in stone and clay, and Whitfield preached it with the same passion he brought to Scripture. Similar systems had evolved independently in cultures across the world because the problem of keeping warm with limited fuel is universal, and the physics of heat storage are the same everywhere. Korean Ondol systems channeled hot air beneath entire house floors. Finnish contraflow stoves use complex internal baffles to extract heat from exhaust before it reached the chimney. Chinese Kong beds warm sleeping platforms with smoke from cooking fires, turning waste heat into comfort. Russian Pechka stoves, which Pyotr had spent his life building and perfecting, had kept families alive through Siberian winters for generations beyond counting. The principle was the same in every culture. Store the heat, release it slowly, let the earth help you. The application varied with climate and materials and tradition, but the underlying truth was as old as the first human who noticed that a stone warmed by fire stayed warm after the fire died. What made Margaret's story remarkable was not that she invented something new. It was that she recognized a solution from one world and successfully transplanted it into another across an ocean and a continent through languages she barely spoke against the opposition of people who were experienced and well-intentioned and wrong. She did not convince them with words because she did not have the words. She convinced them with a blizzard and a thermometer and a warm floor in a frozen world. The evidence spoke for itself as she had always known it would. The only cost was 4 days and 43 below zero, and 3 of James Proctor's toes, and the furniture in Walter Caldwell's cabin, and the winter supply of wood in George Harmon's shed, and the pride of men who had believed they knew better and discovered in the most painful way possible that they did not. Margaret proved her homestead requirements and received title to her land in 1879. The clerk at the land office in Grafton who processed the patent was the same young man who had laughed at her drawings 5 years earlier. He was not laughing now. Whether he remembered the drawings and the laughter Margaret did not know and did not ask because Margaret Sheldon did not revisit closed accounts. She had proven what she needed to prove.